Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to give this Sunday school lesson today on the life of Jesus from astronomy. All right. Now, most of you, even since I was a kid, they all told me that Jesus was not born on December 25th. Okay, that was just a wild guess, whatever. And, I've been told that since I was a kid. So it's not something new that, when was Jesus actually born is the question. And so what I'm going to do today is show you from astronomy how you can pin down the exact day and the exact time of when Jesus was born. All right? So back in ancient times, before they invented calculus, all right, that, astronomers and astrologers were the same thing, okay? They watched the sky, looked at the stars, and there were these things called planets, all right? They were different. They look like stars, but they wander in the sky, all right? And so by looking at how the planets wander around, people tried to surmise if God was trying to tell you something, okay? And so, okay, flip to the first slide here. Okay, here is my summary of the dates of Jesus' life from astronomy. And so I'm just going to ask you to try to think like someone who did back then, possibly, and looking at various astronomical signs of how you could say that this is going to foretell the birth of someone special. All right, so the first one is on August 12th, 3 BC. There was a close conjunction of the planets Venus and Jupiter. So if you have two planets wandering around, they come really close to each other. All right? And I don't know how all these people did the signs of the zodiac or whatever, but there's a constellation of stars called Leo the Lion, which is usually associated with the tribe of Judah, right? Jesus is supposed to be the lion of the tribe of Judah. And on August 12th, 3 BC, there was a close conjunction between Venus and Jupiter. And so if you were someone who knew anything about Jewish history, you might say to yourself, there's something that's going to happen in the tribe of Judah soon. Okay, so the next date, on August 31st, 3 BC, there was a conjunction between the planets Mercury and Venus. All right, in Luke, the angel Gabriel appears to Mary, telling her that she would be having a son who would inherit the throne of David. Now, Mary is puzzled and says, how can this be so, seeing I don't know a man? Well, one of the things that this could be associated with is that women have an approximately 20-day, 8-day menstrual cycle. All right, fertilization of an egg is only possible in the middle of the month. If Mary were having her period at the time when Gabriel arrived, she would know she was not pregnant, not only because she didn't know a man, but she was also, but by the time of the month. Mary was not yet pregnant when she was talking to Gabriel, who says that the Holy Spirit will come upon her in the future to accomplish this miracle. So this sign would be of the conjunction between Mercury and Venus, might be a sign that the angel Gabriel showed up to Mary at the time. All right, the conception of Jesus. Okay, on September 11th, 3 BC, another peculiar astronomical event happened. The sun was in the constellation of Virgo. Now, again, this is a constellation. Why they called it the Virgin, I have no idea. Okay, and it says that the sun, when the moon rose, it rose at the feet of Virgo. Okay, flip the next one. Okay, so the moon is at the bottom here, and there's the constellation Virgo, and the sun is in the position where it's behind her shoulder. Okay, now, and if we look in Revelation, the book of Revelation says, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet." So this sounds like an astronomical event of how do you get a woman clothed in the sun and the moon at her feet? Well, if you looked at the stars here on September 11th, 3 BC, you would see something like that. All right. And so now Revelation goes on to say that the woman is pregnant and is about to give birth. Some take this to be the imagery of the birth of Jesus, but it would hardly be a sign to astronomers that someone special had been born, especially when we consider the later conjunction of Jupiter and Venus. The book of Revelation has lots of figurative language, so it would not be too much of a stretch that the whole pregnancy process, from conception to birth, is represented in this image. Okay. Now, in the summer of 2 BC, there was probably what we call the census of Quirinius. In Luke 2, Luke gives the reason why Joseph had to return to visit Bethlehem at an extremely inconvenient time as Mary was very pregnant. Caesar Augustus had decided to have a census of the Roman Empire. The question arises as to when this census took place, or at least when the census took place in Judea. Now, there are no astronomical signs that correlate with the census of Augustus, but it would have to be 2 BC to fit in this chronology. Okay, but Luke says that the census took place when Quirinius was first governing Syria. All right, Josephus says that Quirinius made a census in 6 AD, about 7 years after what I would say is my chronology. However, this does not preclude that Quirinius wasn't also governing Syria in 2 BC. That 2 BC was when he first governed Syria, and later again governed Syria in 6 AD. All right, Josephus' statement does not preclude that the census took place in different parts of the empire and different parts of Syria and Judea at different times. There's simply not enough historical material to say that there was no census in 2 BC. However, there is enough evidence to say that a census was caused Joseph and Mary to travel to Bethlehem. Okay, all right, the next slide there. A few months before June 17th, 2 BC, Jupiter circled the star Regulus, and this star Regulus is called the King Star. Again, I have no idea why this particular star was called the King Star. And so Jupiter was undergoing what astronomers would say is retrograde motion. Okay, the stars wander in the sky, and sometimes they appear to go backwards and circle around. Okay, this is an apparent motion. And so if I look here at the red line on August 12th, 3 BC, at the far right side of the slide, when we had the first conjunction of Venus and Jupiter, Jupiter started to move, and it circled over the course of time, it circled the star Regulus, which sounds like, if you were an astrologer, that, this star is circling the king star. Sounds like some king may be born soon or is going to come into power. All right. Okay, next slide. Next. Okay. So here's a picture of what they call retrograde motion, that if you look at the star or the planet Jupiter or any other planet, it will sometimes make a circle or seem to go the other one backwards, crisscrossing. That's why they call planets wandering things. And so if you saw the planet Jupiter circle the king star, you might say, hey, something's really going to happen. All right. So, all right, let's do the next slide here. Okay, this is a picture from Starry Night. Okay, on the night of June 17th, 2 BC. I hope you can see that. That the planets Jupiter and Venus are very close together. All right. Now, Luke tells us that on the night Jesus was born, there were shepherds in the field watching their sheep. An angel told them that the Christ had just been born and that they could find him in a stable, wrapped in swaddling clothes. After a concert from the choir of angels, the shepherds went to Bethlehem and found Jesus lying in a manger as they were told. Now, the planet Venus is known as the morning or evening star. Its orbit is such that one can see it only in the early morning before sunrise or in the early afternoon after sunset. On the night of June 17th, 2 BC, the orbital position of Venus meant that it was the evening star. If Jesus was born at the time of the closest approach of the two planets, Venus and Jupiter, that would mean he was born between about 7 and 10 p.m. local time. All right. Okay, and we actually, 2 years ago, all right, next. Okay, so that would be the orbital position of Jupiter and Venus when they have a close conjunction. Okay, the next slide. All right, now if you were here 2 years ago, you could have actually seen something like this, because Jupiter and Venus on March 1st, 2023, were approaching a close conjunction. All right, so, and if you were here too, it happened to be a Wednesday night, okay? So why don't you move to the next star, or the next slide. Okay, it would happen to be a Wednesday night. I took this picture right in the church parking lot, okay? Venus is on the right, Jupiter's on the left, and you can imagine that if the two stars, if the two planets were touching each other, how bright the star would have been. And in fact, computer calculations of the close conjunction of Venus and Jupiter on the night of June 17th, 2 BC, it says that they were so close to each other that probably a close conjunction like that would only happen between every 1,000 to 35,000 years. Okay, so that conjunction of Venus and Jupiter on the night of 2 BC would have been spectacular. All right, this already spectacular enough, but if they're barely touching, you would see one star with the brightness adding together. So that would seem to be the time where when Jesus was born, okay? Because Matthew said, the wise men said, what did they say? We said, we saw his star in the east. Okay, and we've come to worship him. Now, the traditional date of Jesus' birth is December 25th. Many people have pointed out this date seems to be totally out of place, okay? Because that's what I was told as a kid too. Because why would Joseph make a trip to Bethlehem in the middle of winter to comply with Augustus' decree? Okay, why would Augustus order a census in the middle of winter? Okay, and as far as the shepherds go, it's pretty cold outside some of those nights. Would they really be watching their sheep at night? So having Jesus being born in the summer months removes the unnaturalness of both the timing of Joseph's trip to Bethlehem and the shepherd's night's behavior. All right, so okay, now after seeing the bright star, it says the wise men, who probably lived somewhere in Mesopotamia, decided to make plans to travel to Jerusalem and see the newborn king. Planning and making a trip to Jerusalem, if it took about 6 months of planning and traveling, that's probably not too unreasonable. Matthew says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. And it says, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. All right. After the wise men arrived in Jerusalem, Herod the Great tells them to search for their newborn king in Bethlehem. Matthew says that the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over the young child, where the young child lay. All right? Now, if we interpret the planet Jupiter to be the star, Jupiter wanders in the night sky and undergoing retrograde motion, and it even stops at time relative to the fixed stars. If Jupiter were at the stopping point of its motion, okay, this would be on December 25th, 2 BC. All right, let's do the next slide here. Okay, so here's a path of Jupiter in the sky, and where it's undergoing retrograde motion to stop and turn around and go the other way. It's on December 25th, 2 BC. All right, now of course, we have to invoke some special special miracle in here, because it says that even though Jupiter stopped, it says that it stood over where the young child lay. So there must have been some special lighting to tell the wise men that even though Jupiter stopped, of exactly where Jesus was. All right, so as far as December 25th goes, while it's definitely not the birthday of Jesus, it could be the day that the wise men came to visit Jesus in Bethlehem. Now, Matthew's gospel goes on to say that God told the wise men in a dream not to report back to Herod that they found the newborn king. So they returned home without telling him. At the same time, an angel told Joseph to flee to Egypt with Jesus and Mary, as Herod was about to kill Jesus. All right. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote that Herod the Great died after an eclipse of the moon, but before the next Passover. All right, if you look through NASA's catalog of lunar eclipses, we find that there was a lunar eclipse that could be seen in Israel on January 10th, 1 BC. Okay, the next slide here. All right. So now it says 0, and NASA's catalog says 0 instead of 1 BC because, remember, in our traditional calendar, there is no such year as 0 BC. Okay, so NASA, to keep the math straight, Instead of putting 1 BC, they add 1 to it so that you can do the math correctly, all right? If they skip that, everyone would be crazy of how to do things. All right, so Herod's order had to kill all the baby boys 2 years and younger would have to occur sometime, his order, in the last part of December 2 BC, or the first part of January 1 BC. Okay. Now, most historians have placed the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC because there was also a lunar eclipse that was visible in Judea that year. Thus, it has been common to claim that Jesus was born in between 4 and 6 BC. However, if the lunar eclipse of Josephus is really 1 BC, then Jesus' life chronology perfectly aligns with the Jupiter-Venus conjunction, while there are no other astronomical correlations with the 4 BC lunar eclipse. And now, if you're really superstitious, if you look in the NASA catalog, the lunar eclipse in 4 BC was only a partial lunar eclipse. The lunar eclipse in 1 BC was a total lunar eclipse. So, if you say Herod's a real bad guy and all that, then, it'd be more appropriate to have him die after a total lunar eclipse instead of a partial one. So this is what's been causing historians for years of why they're choosing the 4 BC lunar eclipse instead of the 1 BC, I don't know. All right. Now, Jesus' public ministry. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus began his public ministry when he was about 30 years old. And if we do a straightforward calculation from June 17, 2 BC, we would put this date at 29 AD. All right, let me see. Okay, the next slide here. All right. So I put in minus 2 BC plus 1 because there's no year 0. And then there's 30, he's about 30 years of age. So that means his public ministry would begin in 29 AD. All right, furthermore, Luke says that the ministry of John the Baptist began sometime in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. All right, Augustus Caesar died on August 19th, 14 AD. So the 15th year of Tiberius would be between August 28 AD and August 29 AD. Since John was the forerunner of Jesus, if John began preaching in the early part of Tiberius' 15th year, then Luke's date of John the Baptist fits well with the birth of Jesus and his public ministry. Okay, now I'm going to, all right, do the next slide. All right. Now, this is what people have been critics have been trying to say for years. All right, that the gospel writers have only been guessing at the date of Jesus' birth. All right, they say that according to Matthew, Jesus was born in 4 BC because Herod the Great was still alive. But according to Luke, it says Jesus was born 10 years later, when Herod was long dead during a Roman census taken in 6 AD. All right, so people have tried to say that the gospel writers, that they didn't have any first-hand information, that they were guessing years later. But the trouble is that the critics actually are choosing the wrong date for the death of Herod the Great, and also that they're not taking into account that Luke when he says that Jesus' public ministry began in 29 AD, or in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, which is 29 AD, and that he was about 30 years old, that Luke is not talking about the census of 6 AD in Quirinius, okay? Because then the math wouldn't work out. So, okay. So let's go on for the next part. Now, this is not a technical paper on everything, but I'm just going to throw out a number. It says that Jesus' ministry, public ministry, was about 3.5 years. The way people calculate that is that they calculate how many Passovers are mentioned in the Gospels. So that his public ministry is about 3.5 years. And since he was about 30 years old when he began his public ministry, 3.5 years from 29 AD would bring us to about March or April 33 AD. In the book of Acts, Peter on the day of Pentecost gives a speech to the Jews in Jerusalem. And he made the statement that one of the signs that God gives to show that something special is happening is that the moon will be turned into blood in Acts 2:20. And that at least some of the signs happened when Jesus died, as they all knew the recent events. The so-called blood moons occur when there's a lunar eclipse. The occulting of the sun's direct light by the earth and the bending and scattering of indirect light by the earth's atmosphere will often produce a reddish color on the moon, making it look like it turned to blood. Now we know that Jesus died on Passover. Passover occurs on the first full moon after the spring equinox. The date of the spring equinox is about March 20th every year. So looking through the lunar eclipse catalog for March and April in the years around 33 AD yields only one candidate date. On August 3rd, 33 AD, there was a partial eclipse of the moon visible from Jerusalem, which could have produced the blood moon referenced by Peter. Therefore, we can pinpoint the day Jesus died on the cross. Okay. All right, that he died on the cross on April 3rd, 33 AD. And if you go to the next slide there. Now, I just took a picture of got a picture of a recent eclipse of the moon. That this is a much more dramatic picture, okay, whether it looked like that. But again, if you're superstitious and you know, you saw Jesus die and then all of a sudden there's a blood moon that night, you would probably be freaked out, all right? Okay, now, what day? Now, Jesus died on Good Friday, or at least that's what we say, and when you look up what April 3rd, 33 AD is, then on the Julian calendar, the next slide there, oops, back one there. If you look on what it is, sure enough, April 3rd, 33 AD is a Friday. All right. So using the date of April 3rd, 33 AD as the date of the crucifixion, we can calculate the date of Easter Sunday. Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday, April 5th, 33 AD. He appeared to Mary Magdalene and the other women, the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, the apostles, minus Judas, of course, and also minus Thomas. And then it says 8 days later, which, and their counting, probably in our counting system, means 7 days later in our counting system, that Jesus appeared to the remaining 11 apostles, including Thomas. So that would be on April 12th, 33 AD. And finally, The final event of Jesus' earthly life says he ascended into heaven. Okay, it says that was after 40 days. But again, in our counting system, it was probably only 39 days. And so that would mean that he ascended into heaven on May 16, 33 AD. Okay. So I'm going to stop here and ask if you have any questions before I go on to the next section. Okay.
I have a question about on Pentecost, Jesus did get up in heaven. Is that true?
Yeah, well, it says 40 days after, no, Pentecost, that was when the Holy Spirit came, okay? But
Is there two calendars?
no. There's just a different counting system, where it says, after 8 days. In our counting system, it'd mean after 7 days. Okay, depending which culture, you're in. My wife says in Germany, you say a week is 8 days later, okay? But you really mean 7 in our counting system, so.
It's really 7, right?
Yes, okay.
7, and then the 50th is Pentecost.
Yeah, and it might be 49, okay, but, all right.
So does this mean they would count the day, like when they're counting days, they would do the day we're starting off?
So 2 days from now, in one system might mean I count today and then it's tomorrow. We would normally say 1 day from now, which means tomorrow. It's like whether you include the 0 or not, all right? Okay. Yes?
Well, if Luke was interviewing Mary, she would certainly know when he was born, and also she would know when he started his ministry and how long his ministry lasted,
Yes.
and that sort of thing.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Okay. Next slide there. Okay. All right. All right, this is earthquakes. All right, the Gospel of Matthew records 2 earthquakes. The first was when Jesus died. The second was on the morning of the resurrection. Okay? And I got my PhD in seismology, so I'm interested in earthquakes. And here's a map of typically where earthquakes occur. All right. So the question, and you see that they occur in Israel too. So the question a Bible reader should be asking is not, are earthquakes felt in Israel? Instead, the question should be, were any earthquakes felt in Israel in 33 AD? All right, the answer to this question seems to be yes. But before we can get to earthquakes, we need to discuss what are called varves. All right, you want to flip to the next one? Varves. Okay, varves are pairs of sediment layers put down on lake bottoms each year by incoming rivers or streams. During the spring and summer, when the water flow is faster, large heavy grains settle to the bottom of the lake. But during the winter, when the water flow is slower, only small light grain particles settle to the bottom. All right, these particles form a varve pair each year. All right, varves are like tree rings. Okay, the next slide. All right, both record the passage of time. Tree rings form because there is faster growth in the spring, making a lighter color, and slower growth in the summer, making a darker color. Thus, each pair of light-dark rings represents one year. Now, depending on the thickness of the tree rings, one can infer whether there was a drought or not during the growing season. All right, in a similar manner, all right, depending on the smoothness of the layers, one can infer whether there was an earthquake which shook the varves before they sufficiently hardened. When an earthquake occurs, the unhardened varves get shaken and do not form smooth layers. Instead, they form what are called seismites. Okay, the next slide there. Okay, you can see the middle, there's what's called a seismite, that there are smooth layers on the top, smooth layers on the bottom, and there was an earthquake that occurred between the putting down of those smooth layers. All right, now, Josephus records that there was a large earthquake that shook Judea in 31 BC. All right. Supposedly it occurred on September 2nd, 31 BC, because there was the naval battle between Octavian Caesar and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So this is called the 31 BC earthquake. All right. So the earthquake was so large that it produced seismites. It must have produced seismites on the floor of the Dead Sea in 31 BC. The Dead Sea has no plant or fish life in it, so it's an excellent place for varves to smoothly form without any biological disturbances. Okay, now using the lunar eclipse date of April 3rd, 33 AD, if there was an earthquake at the death of Jesus and at the resurrection, these earthquakes too would produce seismites on the floor of the Dead Sea. A seismologist, geologist, looked at these varves and, okay, then the next slide there. Okay. Event B is the varves associated with the 31 BC earthquake, and the C is the varves that are associated with the 33 AD earthquake. Well, unfortunately, using varves and seismites is not as accurate as dating as using planetary conjunctions or lunar eclipses. At best, a seismite can tell you only the year of the earthquake, but not the day. And regrettably, the actual seismite accuracy is only good to a few years. The reason is that although varve pairs are laid down each year, they do not harden immediately. Therefore, there is some uncertainty as what the top varve layer was when the Jerusalem earthquakes occurred. So varves don't give the exact date, but they give a range of dates. So if Josephus's earthquake of 31 BC is taken as a reference point, then there should be 63 varve layers between the 31 BC and the 33 AD. Unfortunately, with the accuracy, we can only pin down the event C as occurring in 31 AD plus or minus 5 years. So that after the 31 BC earthquake, there was another earthquake that could be felt on the Dead Sea between 26 and 36 AD, which means that as far as Matthew's account goes, there's no reason why that this other earthquake couldn't have occurred in 33 AD. Now, Matthew says that the veil of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. Okay, the next slide there. Okay, adding that the earth did quake and the rocks were split. All right. All right, so people have speculated of what happened when it says that the temple veil torn in two. All right, so I have an example here of a curtain, and if you look at the top rod there, suppose that's a rock lentil, which is holding the curtain. When the earthquake occurred, it says if the metal bar represents the heavy lentil, Okay, if it's cracked in the middle by the earthquake, but still held up by the ends, the middle would fall down, and would rip the curtain right in two. Okay? All right, the falling lintel could have ripped the curtain right down the middle where the gap is in my sample curtain. Now, one might object that if the earthquake were so strong as to crack the lintel, the whole temple should have been destroyed. But that does not necessarily have to be the case, because buildings are known to have certain resonance patterns which amplify the effects of shaking only on specific structures. For example, during the Mineral, Virginia earthquake of 2011, my whole house in Maryland shook, okay, to the extent that the lamps were falling over. Yet the only damage I could detect afterwards was a crack in one of the bedroom ceilings. Otherwise, my house suffered no damage from all that shaking. Similarly, it could have been possible that while all of Jerusalem was shaken by the earthquake, only the lintel holding the curtain could have been severely cracked by resonance effects, while the rest of the temple had minimal damage. Okay? Again, this is speculation. And as far as that mineral earthquake goes, depending what building you lived in, you could have had a lot of damage here in Washington. The National Cathedral suffered like $30 million worth of damage, okay? The Washington Monument was closed for like 3 years. So depending, what resonance effects happen, the temple didn't have to be destroyed, but the lintel could have been broken and ripped the curtain in two. Okay. All right. All right, the next slide here. Nope. All right. Now, this is what you see all the time, what people think of the Bible, that it's based on biased information, unreliable, okay, lack of evidence. All right. So here's my summary. All right. History is written after the fact. Some history is written shortly after the events happen, like writing diaries. But most history is written after the events have happened. In order to have an accurate account, the author must either have been an eyewitness to the events or have had access to firsthand information concerning the events. All right. The first issue for the 4 Gospels is that they do not specifically state who wrote them. Why this is the case is unknown. But the unanimous consent of early church history is that the apostles, Matthew and John, Luke, a companion of Paul, and Mark, a companion of Peter, wrote the Gospels traditionally assigned to them. There were many other purported accounts about the life of Jesus and Paul written in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But these works, collectively known as pseudo-epigrapha, have been widely acknowledged to not have been written by the authors named in the text. At best, they are misleading or exaggerated descriptions about the events they described. Of course, the critics of the New Testament claim that the Gospels themselves should be classified as pseudo-epigrapha as well. But this is due to an assumed naturalistic worldview. They reject the assignment by the church of the traditional authorship of the Gospels, saying that no eyewitness, would write anything like that, what is contained in the Gospels. Therefore, any description of a supernatural event must be a complete fabrication or a highly embellished account of the event. However, the critics' presupposition is on plain display when they treat the authorship of other books of the New Testament. They reject that Paul, Peter, James, and John wrote some of the books attributed to them, even though the books specifically name their authors. They believe that the early church was not able to sort through all the early writings about Jesus concerning who were the true authors and who were the forgers. The trouble with this belief is that they arrogantly think that they know better, even though they are much farther in time from the events of the early church. They have to believe that in some grand conspiracy theory that forgers wrote the Gospels long after the apostles and their associates were dead, and then managed to get the whole church to agree to their traditional authorships. So when it comes to the Gospels, what evidence do we have that the authors were eyewitnesses or had access to firsthand information? First, the Gospel of John identifies the author as a disciple of Jesus and an eyewitness to the events he wrote. While the Gospel of John never mentions the name of the Apostle John, it does mention John the Baptist. However, the other three Gospels mention John the Baptist as distinguished from John, the brother of James. Furthermore, the Gospel of John never mentions James, the brother of John, either. So this difference makes sense if the Apostle John is truly the author of the Gospel of John. Second, there is a hint that Mark was an eyewitness to some of the Easter week events. In Mark 14, there's a mention of a young man watching Jesus get arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. When some of the soldiers try to grab him, he flees naked, leaving his tunic behind. Now, this is a really odd incident for Mark to include in the gospel, unless that person was Mark himself. All right, third, Luke says he used eyewitness accounts. Furthermore, Luke and Acts were written to a person named Theophilus, who would have been known to the authors. He would have known if Luke wrote the books assigned to him or had reasonable access to firsthand information. The last part of the book of Acts concerns the life of Paul. It ends when Paul reaches Rome. Paul is said to have been martyred during Nero's persecution of Christians. Since Nero died in 68 AD, the books of Luke and Acts must have been written in the 60s AD or before. This is well within the lifetimes of people who would have been eyewitnesses of Jesus' life in the early 30 ADs. Otherwise, Acts should have obviously ended with the death of Paul if it were written in 70 AD or afterwards. That Matthew and Luke's chronology fit with each other and both line up with astronomy shows that they had firsthand information about Jesus' birth, most likely because Mary was still alive at the time of the writing. If Mary was 15 at the time of Jesus' birth, she would have been about 76 in 60 AD, which is still a reasonable life expectancy for her to give eyewitness information to Matthew and Luke. Matthew says that Jesus was born before the death of Herod the Great. The death of Herod the Great is based on a statement from Josephus that Herod died after an eclipse of the moon. This has widely been believed to be the eclipse on March 13th, 4 BC. But there's also a lunar eclipse on January 10th, 1 BC. All right? So as I said before, if you were to pick which lunar eclipse should you pick, the obvious lunar eclipse is that since the 1 in 1 BC was a total lunar eclipse, that Herod must have died shortly after 1 BC. Okay. All right, Luke says that the reason Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem was because of an order by Caesar Augustus. But he also goes on to say this was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Again, historians seem to be in general agreement that the earliest Quirinius was governor was 6 AD. All right, however, it is clear from the dates of the Gospel of Luke that Luke is not talking about 6 AD. Okay, rather he's talking sometime before 6 AD. The word first has puzzled historians for years and has yet to be fully resolved. Perhaps it will be like the book of Daniel, where King Belshazzar promised to make anyone who could read the writing on the wall the third highest ruler in the kingdom of Babylon instead of the second highest. This puzzle has finally been resolved by realizing that Belshazzar was only the co-ruler with his father Nabonidus. Thus, the position of third ruler in the kingdom was the most Belshazzar could offer. Perhaps in the future, historians will find that there was a previous census before 6 AD to resolve Luke's use of the puzzling word first. Again, Luke showed he had access to firsthand information when he recorded Peter's speech at Pentecost. Peter associates the moon being turned to blood in reference to a lunar eclipse, showing that the people had complicity with Jesus' death. All right, the lunar eclipse on Friday, April 3rd, 33 AD, exactly fits the time frame of the Easter story. Finally, although not as precise, Matthew records 2 earthquakes, which, according to my timeline, occurred on April 3rd and April 5th, 33 AD. While seismite data records cannot pin down the time of the earthquake to the day, it can to within a few years. In any case, 33 AD fits within the range of the occurrence of earthquakes from seismite data. Of course, one might object to the mentioning of earthquakes by Matthew, but not by the other 3 gospel writers. Especially, why did not Mark and Luke mention the earthquake if that is what caused the curtain in the temple to rip down the middle? The only answer to this question is that what is important to one person may not be important to another. As a seismologist, of course I would mention any earthquake, but we should not be so presumptuous to think that someone else, knowing about the temple curtains tearing, would necessarily associate it with the earthquake, or think that there was a cause and effect between the earthquake and the tearing. And just because one person mentions an earthquake and another person does not, should not cause anyone to conclude that there was no earthquake, that Matthew was just making up the earthquakes to tell a more interesting story. So, is there any evidence that the gospel writers, especially Matthew and Luke, were eyewitnesses or had firsthand information on the life of Jesus? It would be hard to imagine someone writing a forgery 100 years after 33 AD without any direct knowledge of Jesus' life. All right, and being able to get the chronology to perfectly to align with astronomy and seismology. Therefore, it appears that the early church did indeed sort out the reliable writings about Jesus from the unreliable writings, that the New Testament books should not be lumped together with pseudepigrapha. And therefore, if you are looking for evidence that miracles have occurred, you can start by reading the life of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels. Okay, that's all right. So, okay.
Do Jesus' birth have to be related with the Jupiter and the moon of when he was born?
Well, let's put it this way. If you take it that way, the chronology works out perfectly between the Gospels and the astronomy. They're totally in alignment.
In your research, did you give any evaluation to the alternative timeline of 30 AD crucifixion and what were your conclusions from it if you did?
There was no lunar eclipse. Okay, and I think that the other supposed date of okay, no, there's no lunar eclipse on the 30 AD. People have suggested 30 AD sometime, but there's no.
Eclipse associated with it? Is that the error?
No, there's a lunar. Well, there are two. There's one lunar eclipse associated with after the death of Herod. Okay. There's another lunar eclipse associated with the death of Jesus. Okay, so the only lunar eclipse that occurs in the 33 AD range is whatever is the one on April 3rd. That's visible from Jerusalem. Okay.
One of the best evidences for it that all of the gospel and the writings, the New Testament, was written before the 60s is the first Holocaust, where maybe 1 million Jews died, is not mentioned as Romans sacked and disassembled the temple and all that.
Yes, that would be for the first 3 Gospels. People have debated when the Gospel of John was written. whether it was written in the 80s or 90s. The Gospel of John.
But how would the rest of the letters of Paul and all?
No, that would be, yes, Paul. It's just that people debated when the Gospel of John was written. Okay, but I mean, Revelation's generally believed to have been written in the late 80s, early 90s. All right. Okay, yes.
If the gospel is wrong, then how can the gospel be all true?
No, I'm saying that the gospel aligns totally with astronomy and seismology as we know it. Okay? So if you were trying to make up a story years after the fact, you would probably, get all these facts messed up. And that's what modern historians have messed up, that they didn't get the right, eclipse of the moon, okay? All right, it's 10:15. It's time for me to stop. Okay, I hope